Funny, when my daughter Jessica looked me straight in the eye and said, "Mom, you're 72 years old, you can't love anymore," I felt my heart crack right down the middle like a dropped dinner plate. There I was, standing in my own kitchen in Portland, Oregon, wearing my favorite lavender cardigan that Harold had bought me for our 40th anniversary.
And my own flesh and blood was telling me my heart had an expiration date. Y'all, I couldn't even catch my breath for a hot minute. The silence stretched between us like the Grand Canyon, and I could feel those tears starting to sting behind my green eyes. My voice broke right in half when I whispered, "Jessica Marie, what are you saying to your mama?" But let me back up a second, sweetie, because you need to understand how I got to that moment standing in my kitchen feeling like I was invisible in my own home. My name is Margaret Rose Thompson, and I've been living in this same house on Maple Street for 47 years. I raised 3 children here, buried my husband Harold 2 years ago, and honey, I thought I was done with surprises. Boy, was I wrong about that. It all started 3 months after Harold's funeral when I decided to try something I'd never done before: online dating. Now, before you start laughing, y'all, hear me out. I was sitting in my living room on a rainy Thursday evening, looking at Harold's empty recliner, and I realized something that scared me more than anything. I was lonely. Not just missing Harold lonely, but deep down in my bones lonely. The kind of lonely that makes you talk to the grocery store clerk for 20 minutes just to hear another human voice. So I did what any modern woman would do. I Googled dating sites for seniors. And honey, let me tell you, there were more options than flavors at Baskin-Robbins. Before I tell you what happened next, and sweetie, this part is going to absolutely shock you. If you're loving this story, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell. You know I get so excited when I see y'all in the comments. Speaking of which, what state are you calling home right now? Drop it down below. And darling, tell me, have you ever had family treat you like you didn't matter? Because your stories help me know I'm not alone in this crazy world. Now let me tell you what I discovered next, because what they did was about to backfire in the most beautiful way. I spent hours on that computer creating my profile on something called Silver Singles. I put up a photo Harold had taken of me in our garden last spring, where I'm wearing my yellow sundress and actually smiling for once. I wrote about how I love gardening, cooking Sunday dinner for family, and how I volunteer at the local animal shelter every Tuesday. Honey, I was proud of that profile. I thought it showed who I really was, not just Harold's widow or the kid's mother, but Margaret Rose, a woman who still had plenty of love to give. The responses started coming in within days, y'all. Messages from men all over Oregon, Washington, even some from California. Most of them were nice enough, widowers like me, looking for companionship, maybe someone to go to the movies with or share a quiet dinner. But then, on a Wednesday morning, while I was having my coffee and reading the paper, I got a message that made me stop mid-sip. It was from someone named James Park. And honey, when I clicked on his profile, I nearly dropped my favorite mug right there on the kitchen floor. James was 45 years old, originally from Seoul, South Korea, but living in Vancouver, Washington, just across the Columbia River from Portland. His photos showed this incredibly handsome man with kind eyes and the most genuine smile I'd ever seen. But here's the thing that really got my attention. His message wasn't like the others. Instead of the usual, "You seem nice, would you like to get coffee?" James had actually read my profile. He mentioned my volunteer work at the animal shelter and told me about his rescue dog, a golden retriever named Buddy. He asked me about my garden and shared that he grew vegetables on his apartment balcony. Y'all, this man was actually interested in me, not just looking for any warm body to fill the loneliness. I stared at that message for probably 30 minutes, honey. My practical mind was saying, Margaret Rose, he's 27 years younger than you. What could he possibly want with an old woman like you? But my heart, oh sweetie, my heart was doing little flip-flops like I was 16 again. I could feel the excitement bubbling up in my voice when I finally called my best friend Dorothy to tell her about it. Dot, I said, you are not going to believe what just happened to me. Dorothy, bless her heart, has been my closest friend since we worked together at Good Samaritan Hospital back in the 70s. She's always been the voice of reason when I needed it most. But when I told her about James, I heard something in her voice I'd never heard before. Genuine excitement. Margaret, honey, you sound happier than you have in months. What's the harm in writing him back? So I did. I spent hours crafting the perfect response, deleting and rewriting it probably 15 times. I told him about my latest batch of tomatoes, asked about his work, which sounded incredibly sophisticated to me, and mentioned that I'd always been fascinated by Korean culture but had never had the chance to learn much about it. When I finally hit send, my hands were actually shaking, y'all. I felt like a teenager asking someone to the school dance. His response came back the next morning, and honey, it was even better than the first one. James told me all about his childhood in Seoul, how his grandmother had taught him to cook traditional Korean dishes, and how he moved to America for college and just never left. He said he'd always been attracted to older women because they had life wisdom and genuine hearts. Those were his exact words, sweetie. Genuine hearts. When was the last time anyone had called my heart genuine? We started messaging every day after that. Long, thoughtful emails that I would print out and read over my morning coffee like love letters. James would tell me about his work, his dreams of maybe starting his own tech company someday, and how much he missed his grandmother who had passed away the year before. I would share stories about raising my children, my years as a nurse, and how much I loved tending to my flower garden. It sounds simple when I say it like that, but honey, these weren't just messages. They were real conversations with someone who genuinely cared about my thoughts and feelings. After 2 weeks of messaging, James asked if I would be comfortable talking on the phone. Y'all, I was terrified and excited all at once. When he called that evening, his voice was warm and gentle with just a hint of an accent that made everything he said sound like poetry. We talked for 3 hours that first night, and when I finally hung up, I realized I was smiling so hard my cheeks hurt. The phone calls became a regular thing every evening at 7, right after I finished my dinner. James would call while he was making his dinner, and we would cook together over the phone. He taught me how to make Korean fried rice, and I talked him through my grandmother's apple pie recipe. It was the most domestic, intimate thing I'd experienced since Harold died, and honey, I was falling for this man harder than autumn leaves. After a month of daily phone calls, James suggested we meet in person. Margaret, he said in that gentle voice of his, I know you might be nervous, but I would love to take you to dinner. There's this beautiful Korean restaurant in downtown Portland that I think you'd enjoy. I could feel my heart racing like a hummingbird's wings, but I heard myself saying yes before my practical mind could talk me out of it. That's when everything started to fall apart with my family, sweetie. When I mentioned to Jessica that I was going on a date, she looked at me like I told her I was planning to rob a bank. Mom, she said, don't you think you're a little old to be dating? And who is this man anyway? I tried to explain about James, how kind and intelligent he was, how he made me laugh and feel interesting again. But Jessica just kept shaking her head like I was some senile old woman who couldn't make good decisions for herself. My son Michael was even worse. When I told him about James over Sunday dinner at his house, he actually laughed. Not a nice laugh, but one of those bitter, condescending sounds that made me want to crawl under the table. Mom, he said, You realize this guy's probably just looking for a green card or trying to scheme you out of your money, right? No 45-year-old man wants to date a 72-year-old woman unless he's got an angle. The words cut me deeper than any knife, y'all. My own son thought I was too old and unlovable to attract anyone genuine. Even my youngest, David, who had always been my most supportive child, seemed uncomfortable with the idea. "I just worry about you, Mom," he said when I called to tell him about my upcoming date. "I mean, what do you really have in common with someone that much younger? Are you sure you're not just lonely and maybe making some poor choices?" Honey, let me tell you, by the time that Saturday night rolled around for my date with James, I was second-guessing everything. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror in the black dress I'd bought special for the occasion, the first new dress I'd purchased since Harold's funeral, and I could hear my children's voices echoing in my head. Was I being foolish? Was I too old for this? Was James really just trying to take advantage of a lonely old widow? But when I walked into Han Oak Restaurant and saw James waiting for me at a corner table, all those doubts just melted away like snow in spring sunshine. He stood up when he saw me, and the smile that spread across his face was so genuine and warm that I felt beautiful for the first time in years. He was even more handsome in person than in his photos. Tall and lean, with kind eyes behind stylish glasses, and this energy about him that just made everything feel more alive. "Margaret," he said, and the way he said my name made it sound like music. "You look absolutely radiant. Not just good for your age or nice considering, but radiant. When was the last time anyone had called me radiant?" That first date lasted 4 hours, sweetie. We talked about everything. His childhood in Korea, my years as a nurse, his dreams for the future, my memories of raising 3 children mostly on my own while Harold worked long hours at the lumber mill. James listened to every word I said like it was the most important thing he ever heard. When I mentioned my volunteer work at the animal shelter, his whole face lit up, and he spent 20 minutes telling me about all the animals his grandmother had rescued over the years. The food was incredible, dishes I'd never tried before, but that James explained with such passion and knowledge that I found myself eager to taste everything. He taught me how to use chopsticks properly, laughing gently when I dropped half my bulgogi on the plate. He said, "It takes practice. My grandmother used to say that learning to eat with chopsticks teaches you patience and mindfulness." I loved the way he talked about his grandmother with such respect and love. It reminded me of how I felt about my own grandmother, who had taught me to garden and cook and see the beauty in simple things. When James walked me to my car after dinner, he asked if he could see me again. "Margaret," he said, "I haven't enjoyed an evening this much in years. You're fascinating and funny and so full of life. Would you maybe want to go for a walk in the rose garden next weekend?" Y'all, I said yes so fast I probably seemed desperate, but I didn't care. For the first time since Harold died, I felt like myself again. Not just a widow or a mother or a grandmother, but a woman worthy of romance and attention. Our second date was even better than the first. We spent the entire afternoon wandering through the International Rose Garden in Washington Park, talking and laughing like we'd known each other for years. James knew so much about flowers and plants. Apparently his grandmother had been an avid gardener too. And we spent an hour just comparing notes on growing techniques and our favorite varieties. When we stopped to rest on a bench overlooking the city, James reached over and took my hand in his. His skin was warm and smooth, and honey, I felt this electric current run right up my arm and straight to my heart. James said, looking right into my eyes, "I need you to know something. I'm not interested in you because I have some kind of agenda or because I'm trying to get something from you. I'm interested in you because you're an incredible woman with a beautiful spirit and a brilliant mind. Age is just a number, and anyone who can't see how amazing you are is missing out on something special. I could feel those happy tears starting to well up in my eyes, and my voice caught with pure emotion when I said, "James, I haven't felt this happy in longer than I can remember, but I have to ask, aren't you worried about what people will think? About what your friends and family will say about you dating someone my age?" He squeezed my hand gently and smiled. My grandmother always told me that love comes in many forms and at unexpected times. She said the heart doesn't check birth certificates before it decides to care about someone. Besides, he added with a mischievous grin, my friends are going to be jealous that I found someone so incredible before they did. That's when I knew I was falling in love, sweetie. Not the desperate, clingy love of loneliness, but real, honest-to-goodness love. The kind where you can't wait to share your day with someone, where their happiness becomes important to you, where you start imagining a future together. It had been so long since I had felt anything like it that I'd forgotten how wonderful and terrifying it could be all at once. But my children were not having it. The more serious things got with James, the more hostile they became. Jessica started dropping by unannounced, clearly checking up on me and looking for evidence that James was somehow taking advantage of me. She went through my mail, questioned me about my bank accounts, and even had the nerve to suggest that I was not thinking clearly because of my age. Michael was even worse. He actually hired a private investigator to look into James's background. When he found out that James had been married briefly in his 20s and divorced without children, Michael acted like he'd uncovered some terrible scandal. "See, Mom," he said, waving the report around my living room like evidence in a murder trial. He couldn't make his marriage work with someone his own age, so now he's targeting vulnerable older women. This is textbook predator behavior. I was so angry I could barely speak, y'all. My voice was dripping with all that irony when I said, "Michael Robert Thompson, are you seriously suggesting that a successful, educated, kind man couldn't possibly be interested in your mother unless he had ulterior motives? What exactly do you think is so unlovable about me?" That shut him up for about 5 seconds, but then he came back with more ammunition. "It's not about you being unlovable, Mom. It's about being realistic. What kind of future can you have with someone 27 years younger? What happens when you get sick? When you need care? Is he going to stick around for that? The thing is, honey, James and I had already talked about all of that. We'd had long, honest conversations about the age difference, about what the future might hold, about the challenges we might face. He told me about watching his grandmother age and how it had taught him that loving someone means being there for all of it, the good times and the difficult ones. "Margaret," he'd said, "I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for real. And what we have is the most real thing I've ever experienced." But my children couldn't see past the numbers. To them, I was just a foolish old woman being taken in by a smooth-talking younger man. They staged what felt like an intervention, all 3 of them showing up at my house on a Sunday afternoon with serious faces and a whole list of concerns they wanted to discuss. That's when Jessica said those words that broke my heart into a million pieces. "Mom, you're 72 years old. You can't love anymore. Not like that. It's time to accept that part of your life is over and focus on being a grandmother and enjoying your golden years quietly." The silence that followed was deafening, sweetie. I could feel all the air leave my lungs at once, and for a moment I couldn't even form words. When I finally spoke, my voice was barely above a whisper. "So that's it? At 72, I'm supposed to just stop? Stop feeling, stop hoping, stop believing I deserve love and companionship?" David tried to soften it a little bit. "Mom, we just think you should be more realistic about your expectations. Maybe find some friends your own age, join a book club or something. But this whole romance thing, It's just not appropriate anymore. Appropriate. There's a word that can cut a person's heart right out, honey. As if love and joy and human connection somehow become inappropriate after a certain birthday. As if the capacity to give and receive love just expires like milk left too long in the refrigerator. I looked at my 3 children. These people I had given my life to raising, who I had loved unconditionally for decades. And I realized they saw me as nothing more than an old woman who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention they threw my way. They couldn't imagine that someone might actually find me interesting, attractive, worth pursuing. In their minds, I was already dead to romance, dead to passion, dead to everything that makes life worth living. But you know what, y'all? Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most are the ones who understand you least. And sometimes you have to choose between their approval and your own happiness. I chose happiness. I told my children that evening that I was going to continue seeing James, and if they couldn't support that decision, then they needed to respect it and keep their opinions to themselves. The conversation that followed was ugly, honey. There were shouting and accusations and threats about cutting me out of family events if I didn't come to my senses. That night, after they left, I called James and told him everything. I was crying so hard I could barely get the words out, but he listened to every broken sentence with patience and understanding. "Margaret," he said when I finished, "I'm so sorry your family is putting you through this, but I need you to know something. What we have is special and real, and it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks about it. The only opinions that matter are yours and mine." "But James," I said, my voice still shaky from crying, "what if they're right? What if I am being foolish? What if this is all just some kind of midlife crisis that's happening 30 years too late?" "Look at me," he said. We were video chatting by then, something I never thought I'd learn how to do at my age. "Do you feel foolish when we're together? Do you feel like you're pretending to be someone you're not?" I thought about it for a long moment, really considered how I felt when I was with James. "No," I said finally. "I feel more like myself than I have in years. I feel alive." "Then that's all that matters, Margaret. Love doesn't have an expiration date, and happiness doesn't become inappropriate just because you've had more birthdays than someone else. Your children are scared because they don't understand, but that doesn't make what we have wrong." That conversation changed something in me, sweetie. I realized I had spent too many years letting other people define what was acceptable for a woman my age. I had been so busy being the good mother, the proper widow, the sensible grandmother, that I had forgotten I was allowed to want things for myself. So when James suggested, about 2 months after that awful confrontation with my children, that we take a trip together, I didn't hesitate to say yes. "Where would you like to go?" I asked, expecting him to suggest somewhere in the Pacific Northwest or maybe California. "Korea," he said, and I could hear the excitement building in his voice. "I want to show you where I come from, Margaret. I want you to meet my family and see Seoul and taste real Korean food and understand the culture that shaped me. I want to share that part of myself with you." Y'all, I nearly dropped the phone. Korea? I had never been further from home than Disneyland with Harold and the kids back in 1985. The idea of getting on an airplane and flying halfway around the world was both terrifying and exhilarating. "James," I said, "I don't even have a passport. I've never been internationally. What if I get sick? What if I can't handle the food? What if your family doesn't like me?" He laughed, that warm, gentle laugh that I had fallen in love with. "Margaret, my family is going to adore you. And as for the rest of it, we'll figure it out together. Besides, my cousin runs a guest house in Seoul that caters to Western visitors. You'll be comfortable, I promise. And think about it. When will you ever have another chance to see the world? to have an adventure like this. An adventure. When was the last time anyone had offered me an adventure? I said yes, honey, right there on the phone without thinking it through or making a list of pros and cons or worrying about what my children would say. Getting that passport was an adventure all in itself. I had to drive down to the Federal Building in downtown Portland and wait in line for 3 hours with all the forms and documents. The young man behind the counter looked at me curiously when I told him I was planning to visit Korea. He asked, "Business or pleasure?" I said, "Pleasure," and the word felt strange and wonderful in my mouth. When was the last time I had done anything purely for pleasure? I didn't tell my children about the trip until a week before we were supposed to leave. I figured if they knew I was planning it, they'd have weeks to try to talk me out of it or sabotage it somehow. As it was, their reaction was about what I expected. Jessica completely lost her mind. She started crying and carrying on about how I was going to die in a foreign country where nobody spoke English, how I was being reckless and irresponsible, how this proved that James had some kind of sinister plan for me. "Mom," she sobbed, "what if you have a heart attack? What if you get lost? What if he abandons you there?" Michael threatened to call the police and report that I was being coerced or manipulated. He actually looked up the number for the FBI's elder abuse hotline and waved it around like some kind of weapon. This is kidnapping, Mom, or at the very least, exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Vulnerable adult? There were those words again, treating me like I was some helpless child who couldn't make decisions about my own life. David took a different approach, trying to guilt me into staying. "Mom, what about Thanksgiving? What about Christmas? We had plans. The grandkids are expecting you to be here." But you know what, sweetie? For the first time in years, I didn't care about their expectations or their plans or their fears. I was 72 years old. I had money in the bank, I was in good health, and I had fallen in love with a wonderful man who wanted to show me the world. Why should I give that up to spend another holiday sitting at a dinner table where I felt invisible and unappreciated? "I'm going," I told them. My voice was steady and calm with an edge of steel that surprised even me. "I'm a grown woman, I'm making my own choices, and I'm going to Korea with James. If that makes me irresponsible or foolish in your eyes, then so be it." The 2 weeks leading up to the trip were both exciting and stressful. I had to buy a whole new wardrobe, including my first ever pair of comfortable walking shoes and a suitcase bigger than anything I'd ever owned. James helped me with everything, patiently explaining Korean customs and teaching me a few basic phrases in Korean. "Annyeonghaseyo" means hello, "감사합니다" means thank you, and "사랑해요" means I love you. That last one made me blush like a teenager, but I practiced it anyway. My friend Dorothy was the only person who seemed genuinely excited for me. She came over the night before I left to help me pack and to give me a farewell gift, a beautiful journal with a leather cover. "Write everything down, Margaret, every sight, every taste, every feeling. This is going to be the adventure of a lifetime." The flight from Portland to Seoul was 13 hours, not counting the layover in Vancouver. I had never been on a plane for more than 3 hours in my life, and I was terrified I wouldn't be able to handle it. But James held my hand during takeoff, brought me magazines to read, and made sure I stayed hydrated and comfortable. When I got restless, he taught me card games. When I got anxious about flying over the ocean, he told me stories about his childhood to distract me. And then, honey, when we finally started our descent into Incheon Airport and I looked out the window at Seoul spread out below us like a glittering sea of lights, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, pure wonder. The city was enormous, bigger than anything I had ever imagined, with mountains rising up in the distance and the Han River winding through it like a silver ribbon. "Welcome to Korea, Margaret," James said, squeezing my hand. "Welcome to my world." The next 2 weeks were like living in a beautiful dream, y'all. James's family welcomed me with such warmth and kindness that I felt like I'd known them for years. His mother, Mrs. Park, spoke limited English, but she communicated with smiles and gestures and the most delicious food I'd ever tasted in my life. She taught me how to make kimchi and bulgogi, laughing gently when I couldn't handle the spicy food at first. "Practice," she would say in English. "Practice, practice, practice." James's sister Minji took me shopping in the incredible markets of Seoul, helping me pick out silk scarves and beautiful ceramics to take home. She was about Jessica's age, but treated me with such respect and interest, asking about my life in America and sharing stories about her own children. It was such a contrast to how my own daughter had been treating me that it sometimes brought tears to my eyes. But the most amazing part of the trip wasn't the palaces or the temples or the bustling streets of Seoul. It was seeing James in his element, surrounded by the people and culture he loved, and realizing that I fit into his world just as naturally as he had fit into mine. We walked hand in hand through the gardens at Cheongdeokgung Palace, and when other couples smiled at us approvingly, I realized that nobody here thought our age difference was strange or inappropriate. Love was love, regardless of the numbers. We stayed in the guest house his cousin owned, a traditional Korean house called the hanok, with beautiful wooden floors and heated ando systems. At night, we would lie on the comfortable floor mattresses and talk about everything, our fears, our dreams, our hopes for the future. James told me about his plan to eventually start his own software company, and I found myself talking about dreams I hadn't expressed in years, maybe traveling more, maybe writing about my experiences as a nurse, maybe finally taking those art classes I'd always wanted to try. "You could do all of that, Margaret," James said one night as we watched the moon rise over the traditional tiled roofs. "Look at what you've already accomplished. You learned to use a computer, you joined a dating site, you flew halfway around the world to a country where you don't speak the language. You're braver than you give yourself credit for." On our last night in Seoul, James took me to dinner at a restaurant on the Han River where we could watch the sunset paint the water gold and pink. We had been talking all evening about everything we'd seen and done, and I was feeling melancholy about leaving this magical place and returning to reality. "Margaret," James said suddenly, reaching across the table to take my hands in his, "I have something I want to ask you." My heart started racing, honey. The way he was looking at me, the serious tone in his voice, I thought maybe he was going to propose, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Was I ready for marriage again? What would my children say? What would people think? But what he said next surprised me completely. "I want you to consider moving in with me when we get back to Portland. Not marriage, not yet anyway, but just being together. I have a beautiful house with a garden that needs someone who knows how to make things grow. I have plenty of room, and I think we could build something really wonderful together." I stared at him for a long moment, processing what he was saying. Move in with him? At my age? Unmarried? The practical part of my brain immediately started listing all the reasons why that was impossible. What would the neighbors think? What would my children do? What about my house, my routine, my independence? But then I looked into James's kind, hopeful eyes and realized that all those objections came from fear. Fear of what other people would think, fear of making a mistake, fear of being truly happy for the first time in years. "James," I said, my voice soft but steady, "are you sure about this? Really sure? Because if I say yes, there's no going back. My children are going to disown me. My neighbors are going to have a heyday. People are going to talk." He smiled that beautiful smile that had captured my heart from the very beginning. Let them talk, Margaret. Let them say whatever they want to say. All I care about is making you happy. And all I want is to wake up every morning knowing you're part of my life. Y'all, I said yes. Right there in that restaurant overlooking the Han River, with Seoul's lights twinkling around us like stars. I said yes to the most impulsive, romantic, completely impractical decision of my entire 72 years. And honey, it felt absolutely perfect. The flight home felt different than the flight there. Instead of anxiety and uncertainty, I felt this calm confidence, like I was finally moving towards something instead of just away from my loneliness. James and I spent those 13 hours planning our future together, which room would be my art studio, how we'd combine our gardens, where we'd travel next. He suggested Morocco, which sounded both terrifying and wonderful. When we landed in Portland, I knew I had to face my children eventually, but I decided to give myself a few days to settle in before dealing with their inevitable outrage. I spent those days moving my most important belongings into James's beautiful craftsman house in the Hawthorne district, marveling at how easily my things seemed to fit into his space. My grandmother's china looked perfect in his dining room cabinet. My plants thrived in his sunroom. My books filled the empty shelves in his office. But I couldn't avoid my family forever, and when Jessica showed up at my old house 3 days after I got back and found it half empty, she completely lost her mind. She called Michael and David, and within an hour, all three of them were standing in James's living room, shouting and crying and demanding to know what this predator had done to their mother while they were in Korea. "Did he brainwash you, Mom?" Jessica kept asking. "Did he threaten you? Are you being held against your will?" "Look around you, sweetheart," I said, my voice calm despite the chaos erupting around me. "Do I look like I'm being held against my will? Do I look unhappy to you?" Because the truth was, y'all, I looked better than I had in years. The trip to Korea had given me a tan and a sense of confidence I'd forgotten I could have. I was wearing a beautiful silk blouse that Mrs. Park had bought for me, and my hair was styled in a new way that Minji had shown me. I looked like a woman who was loved and valued and excited about her future. But my children couldn't see past their own fears and prejudices. They threatened to cut me off completely if I didn't come to my senses and move back to my old house immediately. They said they'd tell the grandchildren that I had abandoned the family. They even threatened to contest Harold's will somehow, claiming I wasn't mentally competent to make major decisions. That's when James stepped in, honey. He had been quietly listening to all their accusations and threats, but when they started attacking my mental competence, he couldn't stay silent anymore. "I think you need to leave," he said, his voice polite but absolutely firm. "You're upsetting Margaret, and I won't allow that in my home." "Your home?" Michael turned on him with fury I'd never seen before. "This is our mother you're talking about, you predatory piece of—" "Michael!" I stood up so fast my chair nearly fell over. "That is enough. James is the most respectful, loving, generous man I have ever known besides your father. How dare you come into his home and speak to him that way?" The room went dead silent, sweetie. My children had never heard me speak to them with such authority, such finality. I could see the shock on their faces, the realization that their compliant, accommodating mother was gone and had been replaced by someone they didn't recognize. "You have a choice to make," I continued, my voice steady and clear. "You can accept that I am a grown woman capable of making my own decisions about my life, or you can continue to treat me like an incompetent child who needs your permission to be happy. But I will not tolerate disrespect toward James, and I will not apologize for choosing love over loneliness." Jessica started crying then, those manipulative tears she'd used since childhood to get her way. Mom, please, we just love you and we're worried about you. Can't you see how this looks? What people are saying? I don't care what people are saying, Jessica. For the first time in my adult life, I truly don't care. I care about being happy. I care about being with someone who values me and treats me with respect. I care about having adventures and making memories and feeling alive. That was 6 months ago, honey. My children have barely spoken to me since that day, except for the occasional guilt-inducing text message or voicemail designed to make me feel terrible about my choices. But you know what? I've never been happier in my entire life. James and I have settled into the most beautiful routine, y'all. Every morning, we wake up together and make coffee. He's taught me to appreciate good coffee, not just the instant stuff I used to drink. We read the news together on his tablet, another thing I never thought I'd learn to use at my age. And then we tend to our garden. We've combined his vegetable growing with my flower expertise, and honey, you should see the paradise we've created in his backyard. Tomatoes growing alongside roses, herbs planted among the lavender, Korean vegetables I'd never heard of thriving next to my grandmother's peonies. In the evenings, James teaches me Korean while I teach him to cook traditional American comfort food. Last week, I made him my mother's pot roast, and he made me authentic Korean barbecue. We eat dinner by candlelight most nights, talking about our days, making plans for the weekend, dreaming about our next trip. We're thinking about Japan in the spring or maybe Italy. I never imagined I'd have so many choices, so many possibilities stretching out in front of me. But the most wonderful thing, sweetie, is how James makes me feel about myself. When I catch my reflection in the bathroom mirror in the morning, I see a woman who is loved and cherished, not just an old widow marking time until she dies. When we're out together, at restaurants, at the farmer's market, walking through Powell's books, he holds my hand proudly, introduces me to his friends and colleagues with genuine affection, treats me like I'm the most interesting woman in the room. Last month, we went to his company's holiday party, and I was terrified that his younger colleagues would judge him for being with someone my age. But honey, it was the complete opposite. They were curious about my experiences as a nurse, fascinated by my stories from the hospital, respectful of my opinions about everything, from politics to technology. One young woman, probably about Jessica's age, told me I was relationship goals because James obviously adored me and I seemed so confident and happy. When was the last time anyone had called me relationship goals? James has also encouraged me to pursue interests I'd put aside years ago. Remember how I mentioned wanting to take art classes? Well, I'm now enrolled in a watercolor painting course at the community college, and I'm actually pretty good at it. My instructor, a woman about my age who went back to art after her own divorce, says I have a natural eye for color and composition. I've painted 3 landscapes from our trip to Korea, and James has them framed and hanging in our living room like they're masterpieces. I've also started writing in that journal Dorothy gave me before the trip. What began as travel notes has turned into something bigger, a memoir about finding love later in life, about refusing to accept society's limitations on older women, about the courage it takes to choose happiness over approval. James thinks I should try to get it published. James, he said just last week, there are thousands of women out there who need to hear your story. You could help them realize it's never too late to start over.
The funny thing is, y'all, I've actually made more friends since moving in with James than I had in years of living alone in my old neighborhood. His social circle has welcomed me completely, and I've discovered this whole community of people who don't think love expires at 70. There's Maria, a 68-year-old artist who's been dating a 52-year-old musician for 3 years. There's Robert, a 74-year-old retired teacher whose wife passed away and who recently married a 58-year-old librarian. There's Janet, who at 70 moved across the country to be with the man she met online, who's 15 years younger. These people understand that love doesn't follow a timeline, that the heart doesn't check ID before it decides to open up to someone. They've taught me that what my children see as inappropriate or embarrassing, other people see as inspiring and brave. You give us hope, Maria told me at a dinner party last month. You prove that our best years don't have to be behind us. But perhaps the most unexpected development in all of this has been my relationship with James's family. His mother, Mrs. Park, calls me every Sunday now. We use a translation app on our phones to communicate, and she's been teaching me Korean recipes while I share my American cooking techniques with her. She sends me packages of Korean ingredients and traditional teas, and I send her photos of our garden and my paintings. It's the most loving, supportive mother-in-law relationship I've ever had. And she's not even technically my mother-in-law. James's sister Minji has become like the daughter I never had, the one who celebrates my successes instead of criticizing my choices. When I told her about my art classes, she immediately ordered 3 of my paintings to hang in her apartment in Seoul. When I mentioned that my own children had stopped calling, she started sending me photos of her kids and updates about her life, making me feel like part of her family. Last month, Mrs. Park even sent me a traditional Korean hanbok, a beautiful silk dress in my favorite shade of green. For special occasions, the note said in careful English, you are family now. I cried when I opened that package, honey. Here was a woman who had known me for less than a year, but who treated me with more love and acceptance than my own children. The contrast became even starker during the holidays. My children made it clear that I wasn't welcome at family gatherings if I brought James. So I made the difficult decision to spend Thanksgiving and Christmas with his family instead. We video called his relatives in Seoul, and they all sang happy birthday to me in Korean when they learned it was my 73rd birthday on Christmas Eve. They toasted me with Korean rice wine and told James how lucky he was to have found such a wonderful woman. Meanwhile, I got exactly 3 text messages from my own children over the entire holiday season. Jessica sent a cold, "Merry Christmas, Mom," with no invitation to join their celebration. Michael sent nothing at all. David called on New Year's Eve, but only to tell me that the grandchildren were asking where Grandma was, and he didn't know how to explain that I was living in sin with a stranger. Living in sin. As if love and companionship and mutual respect were somehow sinful just because we hadn't had a ceremony to make it official in the eyes of the government. As if the happiness and peace I'd found were somehow wrong because they didn't fit into his narrow definition of appropriate behavior for a woman my age. But you know what, sweetie? Their rejection stopped hurting so much when I realized how much love and family I'd gained in return. James's friends have become my friends. His family has embraced me as one of their own. I have a social life that revolves around interesting conversations and new experiences instead of obligation and guilt. And the romance, honey, the romance is better than anything I experienced in my youth. James brings me flowers every Friday, just because. He leaves little notes in Korean around the house for me to translate and find. He runs my bath water when I've had a long day volunteering at the animal shelter. He listens to me read passages from my memoir and offers thoughtful feedback. He holds my hand while we watch Korean dramas with subtitles, patiently explaining cultural references I don't understand. Last week, he surprised me with tickets to see a Korean cultural performance at the Arlene Schitzner Concert Hall. We dressed up, me in the silk dress Mrs. Park had sent, him in a beautiful suit that brought out his eyes, and spent the evening immersed in traditional music and dance. During intermission, an elderly Korean woman approached us and spoke to James in rapid Korean, then smiled at me warmly. "What did she say?" I asked as we returned to our seats. James looked embarrassed but pleased. "She said you looked radiant and that we seemed very much in love. She also said it was nice to see an American woman who appreciated Korean culture."
Radiant. There was that word again, the one that made me feel beautiful and valued and alive. But the real test of our relationship came about 3 weeks ago, when I caught a terrible flu bug and was sick for nearly 2 weeks. I was worried that James would realize what he'd signed up for, caring for an older woman who might get sick more often, who might need more medical attention as she aged, who might become a burden rather than a partner. Instead, honey, he took care of me like I was the most precious thing in his world. He made homemade chicken soup and Korean ginger tea. He brought me books and magazines and set up a laptop so I could video chat with Dorothy when I was feeling up to it. He slept on the couch so I could rest better in the bed, but checked on me every few hours to make sure I had everything I needed. When I was finally feeling better, I tried to apologize for being such a burden, for showing him the reality of dating someone my age. But James just shook his head and pulled me close. "Margaret," he said, "taking care of someone you love isn't a burden, it's a privilege. When you love someone, you want to be there for the difficult times as well as the easy ones. That's what love means." His words reminded me of my grandmother, who used to say that real love wasn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone whose imperfections you can embrace. James doesn't see my age as a flaw to overlook. He sees my life experience as wisdom to learn from, my wrinkles as evidence of a life fully lived, my slower pace as an invitation to be more mindful and present. 2 weeks ago, we celebrated the 1-year anniversary of our first message on that dating site, and James had a surprise for me that left me absolutely speechless. He had been working with a local Korean restaurant to plan a special dinner featuring all the dishes we'd shared in Seoul, complete with traditional music and decorations. But the real surprise came when Mrs. Park's voice came through his laptop screen. She had arranged to video call us during dinner so she could celebrate with us from Seoul. "Margaret," she said in her careful English, "you make my son so happy. You are a gift from heaven for our family." A gift from heaven. Can you imagine, y'all? Here I was, worried that my children saw me as an embarrassment, and this wonderful woman halfway around the world saw me as a blessing.
That night, as we were cleaning up from dinner, James took my hands in his and said something that made me realize how completely my life had changed. "Margaret, I know we've talked about the future in general terms, but I want to be more specific. I want to marry you, not because I think we need a piece of paper to validate what we have, but because I want the whole world to know that you're my family, that we're committed to building a life together." I stared at him for a long moment, processing what he was saying. Marriage at 73 to a man 28 years younger. The practical part of my brain immediately started calculating all the potential problems: legal complications, family drama, social judgment, financial implications. But my heart, oh sweetie, my heart was singing like a bird at sunrise. "James," I said, "are you absolutely certain about this? Because once we're married, there's no pretending this is just a phase or a temporary arrangement. This becomes real in a way that will shock people and force them to accept us as a legitimate couple." He smiled that beautiful smile and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Margaret Rose Thompson. Will you marry me?" The ring was perfect, honey. Not some flashy diamond that would have looked ridiculous on my wrinkled hands, but a beautiful emerald surrounded by small diamonds that brought out the green in my eyes. It was sophisticated and elegant and completely appropriate for a woman my age, but it was also romantic and precious and everything I'd ever dreamed of. I said yes, of course.
How could I not say yes to the man who had given me back my life, who had shown me that happiness doesn't have an expiration date, who loved me not despite my age, but because of everything my age represented? We're planning a small ceremony for this spring, honey. Nothing fancy, just James's family and friends, plus Dorothy and a few of the new friends I've made through him. We'll have it in our gardens, surrounded by the flowers we've planted together and the vegetables that represent the life we're building side by side. I sent invitations to my children last week, even though I don't expect them to come. The invitation was simple and elegant, printed on cream-colored paper with a photo of James and me from our trip to Korea. Margaret Thompson and James Park request your presence at their wedding celebration, it read, followed by the date, time, and location. Jessica called within 2 hours of receiving her invitation, and the conversation went exactly as I expected. Mom, you cannot be serious about this. You're 73 years old. People are gonna laugh at you. They're gonna think you've lost your mind. Jessica, I said, my voice calm and steady, the only peoples whose opinions matter to me are mine and James's. Everyone else can think whatever they want to think. But Mom, what about the family? What about Dad's memory? How can you dishonor him this way? That's when I felt my patience finally snap, honey. Dishonor your father, Jessica Marie? Your father would want me to be happy. He would want me to have love and companionship and joy in my remaining years. He certainly wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my life alone and lonely just to satisfy your narrow ideas about appropriate behavior for widows. The conversation ended with Jessica hanging up on me, but I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me was the call I received the next day from my oldest grandson, Tyler, Jessica's son, who just turned 25 and has always been my favorite of the grandchildren. Grandma, he said, I saw your wedding invitation and I think it's amazing. I've been wanting to call you for months, but Mom forbade us from having any contact with you after you moved in with James. But I'm an adult and I make my own decisions about who I love and support. Y'all, I started crying right there on the phone. Tyler, I managed to say, you have no idea how much this means to me. Grandma, I've seen the photos you post on Facebook from your travels and your art classes and your new life. You look happier than I've seen you since Grandpa died. If this James guy makes you that happy, then I'm happy for you. And I'd like to come to your wedding if you'll have me. Of course I'll have you, sweetheart. But what about your parents? What about the rest of the family? Tyler was quiet for a moment, then said something that showed me he was wiser than his 25 years should allow. Grandma, love is rare and precious, and it should be celebrated no matter what form it takes or when it happens. Anyone who can't see that is missing the point of life entirely. That conversation gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, some members of my family would eventually come around. But even if they don't, honey, I know I'm making the right choice. I know because every morning I wake up grateful for another day with James. I know because every evening we spend together feels like a gift. I know because for the first time in years, I'm excited about the future instead of just enduring the present. Last weekend, James and I went to look at wedding venues, just in case the weather doesn't cooperate for a garden ceremony. We visited this beautiful small hotel in the Pearl District that specializes in intimate weddings. The event coordinator, a lovely woman about my daughter's age, was so excited to work with us. "This is wonderful," she said as she showed us around the space. "We don't get nearly enough mature couples who are celebrating finding love later in life. Your story is so romantic and inspiring. Romantic and inspiring. Not inappropriate or embarrassing or shameful. Romantic and inspiring. As we were driving home from the venue, James reached over and took my hand. "Margaret," he said, "I want you to know something. Whatever happens with your children, whatever people say or think about us, this has been the best year of my life. You've taught me what real love looks like, not the desperate, needy kind, but the mature, thoughtful, generous kind that comes from two people who know themselves and choose to share their lives." I squeezed his hand and felt that familiar warmth spread through my chest, the feeling I'd forgotten I could have, the feeling of being truly, deeply loved. "James," I said, "a year ago, I thought my life was over. I thought the best I could hope for was to fade quietly into old age, maybe babysit some grandchildren occasionally, maybe volunteer at the church bazaar. I thought love was for younger people, that passion and romance and adventure were things I'd already used up." I paused, watching the familiar streets of Portland roll by, thinking about how much had changed in such a short time. "But you've shown me that life doesn't end at 72. It just begins a new chapter. And honey, I can't wait to see what the next chapter holds for us." As I'm finishing up this story, y'all, I'm sitting in our sunroom, looking out at the garden James and I have created together. My easel is set up beside me with a half-finished watercolor of the Korean temple we visited last year. James is in the kitchen making dinner. Tonight, it's Korean-style tacos, a fusion dish that represents how beautifully our two cultures have blended together. In 3 weeks, we'll be husband and wife. In 6 months, we're planning another trip to Korea so I can meet more of his extended family. In the fall, we might take that trip to Morocco he's been suggesting, or maybe Italy, or maybe we'll just stay home and tend our garden and host dinner parties for the wonderful friends who've become our chosen family. The point is, sweetie, we have choices. We have possibilities. We have a future full of love and laughter and adventures yet to be discovered. And none of that would have happened if I had listened to my children when they told me I was too old to love anymore. So, if you're listening to this story and you're thinking about your own life, about dreams you've put aside or chances you haven't taken because someone told you it was too late, I want you to remember something. Love doesn't have an expiration date. Happiness doesn't become inappropriate after a certain number of birthdays. Adventure doesn't stop calling your name just because you've accumulated some wrinkles and gray hair. You are never too old to start over. You are never too old to choose yourself. You are never too old to fall in love. And honey, if anyone tells you otherwise, even if it's your own children, you tell them that Margaret Rose Thompson said they're wrong. Because at 73 years old, I'm living proof that the best chapters of your life might still be unwritten. Y'all, I hope you've enjoyed hearing about my adventure because it's been the most beautiful, unexpected gift of my lifetime. And who knows? Maybe it'll inspire you to write your own love story, no matter what age you are or what obstacles you think you're facing. Because, sweetie, life is short and love is precious, and we owe it to ourselves to grab hold of both with everything we've got. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go help my fiancé with dinner. We're expecting guests tonight. Some wonderful friends who understand that love stories don't end at 72. Sometimes that's exactly when they begin.